Thank you, Daniel. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. Thank you for joining our last of our four-part series of the Plan Giving Zoom presentations we've been having for the last few Thursdays. My name is Cynthia Hizami, and I'm the Director of Plan Giving for Jewish National Fund for the West Coast. I am joined on the call by my colleagues, Chief Plan Giving Officer Matt Bernstein, Robin Dermer, Bill Adolph, and Judy Feig, and we help people like yourselves make tax-wise gifts to Jewish National Fund, making sure that they fulfill their philanthropic desires while also considering tax consequences. We are here to, Chris Herthel is here, and he will be presenting on commercial real estate, valuations, and landlord-tenant issues in the era of COVID-19 and beyond. I would like to introduce our moderator, Alan Brodetsky. Alan is the president of Boutique Realty, Boutique Property Management, and Reliable Home Loans. He prides himself on being a one-stop shop for real estate and brokerage needs and has been helping his clients with property management services and real estate financing for over 15 years. When not working, he spends time with his wife and his two beautiful children. He enjoys fishing and gardening. He joined our JNF Futures Board about a year ago and is enjoying becoming more involved with Jewish National Fund in a leadership position. And now I would like to welcome Alan Brodetsky.
Thank you, Cynthia. As many of you know, JNF was established in 1901 and has supported the land and people of Israel for more than 100 years. The work is varied in scope and has tremendous impact on the daily lives of Israelis and beyond. Jewish National Fund, with your support, is helping to strengthen a nation for the present and future generations. Whether it's developing the Negev Desert, providing services, programs, and dignity for those with special needs and disabilities, ensuring water reclamation and recycling, or developing innovative agricultural techniques for Israel and the world, Jewish National Fund projects are addressing the critical needs of Israel and her citizens. I am proud to be a JNF board member and know our efforts are helping to preserve our Jewish homeland. At this time, I would like to introduce our speaker, Chris Herthel. Chris is the Director, Real Estate Advisory Services for Moss Adams, a fully integrated personal services firm. He has provided commercial real estate investment and development advisory services since 1996. He leads the firm's real estate advisory services and provides independent, customized guidance on commercial real estate investment, management, and financial strategies to clients. Please help me welcome Chris Herthel.
Thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Good day to you. These are crazy, uncertain, and sometimes scary times, but I think there is some good news coming out of the world, so it's good to be with you today. So we're going to talk about the commercial real estate market today and some of the impacts that we're seeing relative to COVID-19. So with that, let me jump into the presentation here. First, as Alan so nicely introduced me, I run our real estate advisory practice at Moss Adams. Moss Adams is a Seattle-based professional services firm. We really have three major business lines. One is your traditional CPA services, accounting services. Two is consulting, business advisory consulting across industries. And then the third is we have a wealth management practice managing approximately $3 billion of client capital. So my background is I've been in the commercial real estate investment and management business for 20 plus years with several real estate investment firms. And that incorporated both investing and managing across most of the major property types throughout the country. So our real estate advisory practice here at Moss Adams, and Bill, if you would advance to slide 4, please, thank you. Our real estate advisory practice at Moss Adams, really, to simplify it down to what we do, we help individuals and organizations make good decisions relative to commercial real estate, whether that's real estate investment, development, operating real estate, or financing real estate. And we really advise all the key stakeholders across the spectrum. That includes owners and operators, investors and limited partners, tenants and corporate owners or users, nonprofits, foundations and endowments, and lastly, governments, both local and state level. Okay, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit today about the market overview, commercial real estate market overview in the times of this crisis. And then we'll get into some nuts and bolts regarding some of the impacts to both landlords and tenants and how they're resolving those issues as a result of COVID-19. And I know we plan on leaving sufficient time at the end of this presentation for plenty of question and answer. So don't be shy later on. Please ask your questions. All right, jumping in here. So, you know, when you talk about commercial real estate, one of the primary topics that everybody wants to hear about and talk about. As many of you know, commercial real estate valuations are dependent upon two things. One is the cash flow generated from the real estate, and then the rate of return, or in industry parlance, the cap rate that's required on the property. So this is a slide that looks at the cap rate element, and this is information from Center Square Investment Management, one of the groups that I really enjoy the research and their thought leadership on the commercial real estate space. That is public real estate markets, or the REIT market, as it's often referred to. So this slide is based on. Can everybody hear me? Okay. By the way,
There's some internet kind of static, I think.
Okay. Well, let me know if it gets worse.
Okay.
So looking at the cap rates here, so this is some based on data from Center Square Investment Management as to what's happened primarily in the public real estate markets since January, or since the crisis started coming out in the marketplace. And as you can see, cap rates are generally up, meaning rate of return for a real estate investment is generally up, which therefore results in values being down. And as you can see, all real estate it's not created equal. You have significant value reductions on the left side of this chart, which includes hotels, student housing, and retail. And on the right side, you know, some of the least impacted real estate sectors, including data centers and cell towers, manufactured housing, and single-family rentals. Next slide, please. So looking at asset values here, as I mentioned, as cap rates go up, asset values go down. This is an interesting chart from Center Square where they are seeing value declines in the public real estate markets across different property types. That's a different look at it. As you can see, you know, malls and hotels are down significantly. The other thing that this chart shows is the difference in valuation impact in today's crisis versus the global financial crisis back in 2008 and 9. And as you can see, there hasn't been the value impact yet on as a result of this crisis versus the global financial crisis. So will be interesting to see how this changes over time. All right, the next slide, please. So what we're seeing currently in the real estate markets, you know, clearly transaction volume is way down, really due to the freeze up or temporary freeze up of the debt markets. Obviously, lots of economic uncertainty. And also there's just a lack of price discovery. So buyers are very uncertain as to how to value properties. And so therefore, and sellers still have outdated visions of what their properties are worth. So there's very little transaction activity as a result. We're also seeing that the impact of COVID-19 is really going to accelerate some secular trends in the real estate industry. This includes the continued rise of e-commerce. We're going to see some significant reduction in retail space and most likely hotels as well, as going into this crisis, we were already over-retailed, had a much higher amount of retail space per capita than many other leading Western economies throughout the country. So clearly there's going to be a reduction in retail space coming out of this crisis. The other thing that we're going to start to see, we believe, is that there's going to be a lower density in real estate, whether that's in an office building, in living environments, and such. And we'll get into this in a little bit more detail in a little while. The other thing we are seeing, as I've given you a glimpse of, is we do expect to see reductions in valuations, and that's going to be a result of, as I showed you, increases in cap rates as well as reduction in cash flows. We believe, based on our information and Center Square's and some other leading economic forecasters, that we believe cash flows will be impacted, reduced by about 5% on average. Clearly, that's going to be higher for retail and hotels and less for industrial and some of the other more recession-resistant property types. The other thing to keep in mind as it relates to real estate is there's always a lag effect. Real estate generally lags the overall economic activity, just given the lease structures. So we don't think that we're going to see the full impact of this crisis on the commercial real estate markets, whether it's in the cash flow or in the ultimate valuation impacts, until next year. Usually it's about 4 or 5 quarters after the shock or market correction. So we think it'll most likely happen around the second quarter of next year. Okay, next slide, please. Back to valuations for a second. If you take into account, some cap rate increase as well as some cash flow reduction, we think that's going to net out to about a 10 or 15% reduction in values across the board. Again, there's going to be varying impacts to different property types. And so, we do see some distress that will result from that. But ultimately, the real estate markets were in generally good shape going into this crisis. And as the economy starts to rebound, we do think that real estate will firm up as well. But in the short term, we do see some distress, which in many minds, that leads to opportunity. So whether you're an equity investor or potentially a source of debt capital, we do see some interesting opportunities coming out of this crisis. One of the things that we're keeping an eye on is there was a significant amount of bridge lending done on real estate over the last 5+ years, much of it in bridge lending format. So properties that were in some level of transition that owners put on relatively short-term debt to take their properties through that transitionary period, looking to refinance when it was stabilized. There's a lot of that needs to happen over the next couple of years. And it'll be interesting to see, given the impact of COVID, reduction in cash flow, potential reduction in valuations, how those properties get refinanced. So there's many parties that are looking at that as a potential opportunity to be a source of either what we call gap equity, where to do a refinance you have to put in more cash, or offering flexible loan options. So that will be an interesting area of opportunity over the next couple of years. One of the factors that supports our thesis that ultimately the real estate markets will regain health here is that even before this crisis, there was a significant amount of capital that had been raised to invest in real estate. Much of that capital has yet to be invested, and much of it was raised from investors with the business plan that everybody expected some sort of correction in the near term. So, COVID-19 has brought that correction, and so there's a fair amount of capital that is on the sidelines waiting to be invested. And we believe that provides a support for real estate values over time. All right. So let me dig into a little bit more granular look at the different property types here. And let me just do a sound check here real quick. Cynthia, am I sounding okay? Is the sound coming through?
Sure. Yeah. Great.
Thank you. So let me start with industrial. As you saw on previous slides, industrial is viewed as, even before COVID, was one of the more in-demand property types from an investor's perspective, and we believe that will continue. While there's been some short-term disruption in trade flows due to the global recession and the COVID issues, which maybe has had some short-term impacts on industrial, long-term, there's a lot of good trends that support industrial property. Clearly, one of those primary trends is the rise of e-commerce. We've seen e-commerce become a larger share of overall sales from 10% 10 years ago to currently 20%. Center Square and some other economists, and we support it, we believe that that number reaches close to 50% over the next 10 years. We just really think that this experience will accelerate the demand for e-commerce. Clearly that supports industrial properties as Amazon needs more space and others. So the other thing that I think is a new trend as a result of COVID-19 as it relates to industrial is, everybody's heard about the just-in-time inventory model, which has been in vogue for the last 10 plus years, minimizing time that product sits in warehouses and inventory, and that product coming over from, overseas primarily. That is, we believe, is going to shift. We think that retailers are not going to want to be at risk for product coming in from overseas. And there's going to be more onshoring of production of product. And most retailers are going to want a better, more dependable delivery system. And that includes having inventory in the United States. So we think it's going to shift from a just-in-time inventory model to a just-in-case model, and therefore will support the need for more warehouse and industrial product. All right, next slide, please. Multifamily or apartments. Currently, there's definitely some disruption in the multifamily markets, COVID. Lack of leasing activity. Obviously, nobody can go tour apartment buildings. Everybody's sheltering in place. Clearly, there's a lot of job losses, people uncertain about their ability to either get an income, and if they do have an income, to pay rent. There is beginnings of talk, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, but talk of political implications relative to renters and landlords and potential moratoriums on evictions. Good news is, based on data from the National Multi-Housing Council, is that rent collections in April were relatively strong, and in May were relatively strong. As of May 15th, NHMC survey reported that 87% of renters of apartments were still paying their rent. We'll see how that changes over time as some of the stimulus payments and unemployment benefits run out, if people will still continue to pay rent. But so far, it's held up pretty well. So in the short term, we believe there to be some disruption in the multifamily markets. Clearly, job losses, poor economic conditions will impact real estate in general. It will impact multifamily. But there are definitely long-term trends that support multifamily as well. As the uncertainty continues, people will not be in a position to buy homes, so that will drive them to rental multifamily. We also believe that the types of multifamily demand will change. We do think that there will be somewhat of a reversal in the trends toward more urban living. We think people are going to be more interested in less dense suburban living, given the experience they've been through here with COVID-19. And they're going to want different things out of their rental property. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. All that to say, we believe that this new and upcoming real estate segment of single family rentals is going to benefit here. We believe that not only are the millennials getting to the point in their lives where they want to have families, and their economic uncertainties, we think they're going to be more renters of single-family homes. Okay, next on the office buildings. This one's probably the most uncertain. Lots of arguments that office space will be negatively impacted. Some are arguments that it'll be positively impacted. So clearly there's going to be some changes in the office market. Density, these dense open floor plans that many tenants migrated to over the last few years that's going to be reversed. They're going to have to give people more space in their office buildings. There's been a lot of companies that have noticed that this remote working thing actually works okay, and so they're going to choose to keep employees working from home and not bring them back into the office. But it's clearly a counterbalance, because if you bring employees back, you're going to have to give them more space. So maybe some companies need more office space, but there's also maybe more employees are working from home. So it presents a very unclear picture as to where the net effect will be on office use coming out of this. But in addition, we do believe that the trend of older office product will continue to suffer, and probably will suffer more. Over the last few years, most of the demand and absorption and rent growth for offices has been experienced in the higher quality, what we call Class A office space. And we think that's absolutely going to continue and accelerate as tenants will increasingly seek high quality, modern, well-managed office space coming out of this COVID-19 crisis. Okay, retail. Clearly, retail is the poster child for being negatively impacted here as a result of COVID. It was already beginning. It's going to accelerate. We're already seeing major retailers go bankrupt, and what landlords are going to do with all that empty space. So we are seeing, relative to some of the other property types, much more activity on landlords and retail tenants trying to renegotiate leases, do workouts. There will clearly going to be some litigation that come out of that. But generally, we think this is going to accelerate a retail shakeout, reduction in retail space throughout the country, and potentially a real change where a lot of the successful retail real estate over the last few years has been the real estate that offers chances for folks to gather together, whether that's restaurants or entertainment, sort of that third place where people like to gather. And that's certainly questionable going forward. Are people going to want that, or are they going to use retail strictly to get their essential services, to get their groceries, to get their gas and other things? So long-term, retail has some real uncertainty due to pre-existing trends, but also clearly what COVID has brought to us. And then lastly, touch on hotels here for a minute. Hotels will also be impacted. We believe that travel will take a long time to recover. Businesses will most likely continue to scale back their travel needs. They've experienced that, Zoom meetings actually work, and they provide a lot of efficiency and cost savings. And we just believe that most people will choose not to travel, get on an airplane, or stay in a hotel, or go to large gatherings. So we do see some long-term challenges for hotel space. The other thing to mention too about hotels, in addition to just the reduction in demand, is that we believe there will be increased operating burdens on hotel owners and operators due to the new sanitary standards, in terms of housekeeping, what they do with shared mechanical HVAC systems, how do they handle baggage, that kind of thing. So the hotel industry has a lot to figure out coming out of this COVID crisis. One of the things that we like to look at when we're studying the real estate markets is what's happening on the construction front as new real estate is being constructed. So we've collected some data here from a number of sources, but clearly COVID-19 has reduced the construction activity in the marketplace. Architecture firms are a great leading indicator of what's happening in the construction space. They are reporting pretty significant declines in new work. Obviously many job sites, depending on what state you're in and some of the limitations there, many job sites have been shut down. All this to say that construction will be impacted, which therefore real estate will be impacted. As many of you know on this call that own real estate and maybe have developed real estate, delays in the construction can be very expensive. So we're clearly seeing delays, costs are going up, and on the flip side, demand picture is weakening. So lots to keep an eye on here in the construction space. So you can't comprehensively talk about commercial real estate without talking about the debt markets, as the real estate market is very dependent upon the supply of debt capital. So take a few minutes here and talk about where we are there. Clearly, the real estate debt markets are not fully operating right now. They have recovered somewhat from the initial shock of the shutdown and that varied by the type of lender. The mortgage REITs were sort of put out of business initially, and they really haven't come back. The conduits or the CMBS markets are also pretty much shut down right now. There is some glimmer of hope that some of that's coming back, but clearly the conduits and CMBS lenders are virtually sidelined right now. The life insurance companies, they've always been very conservative lenders. They were conservative coming into this, and they're basically taking a wait and see approach right now. And really, unless there's some special circumstances, they're really not lending. They're waiting for this whole thing to shake out a little bit more. The agencies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, quasi-governmental supported agencies, they're really focused on residential and multifamily lending. And they've really slowed down their lending activity and tightened their standards. So we believe that they're going to continue, but very limited right now. Commercial banks have generally remained open for business, although they've reduced their lending activity and they've significantly increased their underwriting standards. So, so there is commercial debt out there available from the banks, but harder to get. And then lastly, the debt funds. These are your private, non-regulated lenders that have become a big force in the marketplace since the great financial crisis. And they've been relatively active still. They're looking at this as a window of opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, to be that flexible entrepreneurial lender. Some of them have been impacted because they are dependent upon warehouse lines of credit to fund their lending business, and that's been disrupted to some degree. But generally, the debt funds are still in business and making loans. So with that, let me get into some of the nuts and bolts here in terms of what we're seeing on the lease and loan restructuring going on relative to the crisis. I know we probably have a mix of folks in the audience, some that own businesses that are tenants and some that are owners of real estate. And really, while you're on two sides of the table, potentially, all this sort of is relevant for both sides. One of the interesting things that we're seeing, and I've never seen it before in my 20-year career in real estate, is that we're seeing a very collaborative and empathetic negotiation environment right now. Whether it's tenants, landlords, lenders, everybody's making really good efforts to work out the issues. Unlike some prior times in history where there's usually a guilty party, if you will. No one's guilty in this circumstance, so everybody's coming together to try to work it out. And that includes the feds and the banking regulators that are being fairly lenient in allowing banks to to work out loans with borrowers, but then also just relative to tenants and landlords, seeing a lot of good collaborative efforts being put forth. So with that, generally leases and loans don't give folks the right to exclusive express rights to not pay rent or make mortgage payments. There's some politicians out there that are trying to make that otherwise, but we'll get to that in a minute. I think our best practices that we've seen in the marketplace right now is to be proactive, communicate your needs to your tenant, to your landlord, whatever the case may be. Be very diligent in providing them information as to what your circumstances are, the financial impact to your business, and be sure to provide a go-forward plan that is feasible based on the current circumstances of your business. That would include financial pro forma, and also many landlords are asking tenants to provide proof that they've sought out help in the other stimulus programs that are available, whether it's the PPP program or the Main Street Lending Program, both of which have been, widely tapped into here. And many landlords are also making sure that tenants are seeking out business interruption insurance if they can. Many policies have specifically excluded pandemics, but there is some success being had in the world right now with businesses being able to collect on business interruption insurance. So that's been an important element of both landlords and lenders wanting to know that tenants and businesses are exploring all options. So, our recommendations, if you're dealing with the need to restructure your lease or restructure your loan, is, really, as I mentioned earlier, everybody's being collaborative. Try to find areas of mutual benefit. Obviously, the priority for tenants in this environment is to preserve cash, manage their cash flow, and landlords really don't want occupancy in today's market. They are going above and beyond to retain their tenants, even at reduced rental rates. So we do think there's lots of opportunities for mutual benefit here. It's important to understand all the stakeholders in the chain. If you're a landlord, you sort of get this, but many tenants, we find they don't understand that if they don't pay the rent, landlord's potentially not able to pay the mortgage or their property taxes. Property taxes support a lot of necessary services. And if you don't make if the landlord doesn't make mortgage payments, the bank's hurt. That ripples effect through the whole system. So everybody needs to understand they need to do their part to sort of keep this ecosystem together. Some of the things that we're seeing relative to issues between tenants and landlords that are working pretty well. The tenant, if you're a tenant, in return for some rent forgiveness or rent deferral, you can offer to extend your lease term. You can offer to relinquish options that you have in your lease, whether that's a termination option, a right to first refusal on additional space. There are CC&R approvals, which means, conditions and restrictions on the property. You may have some approval rights over those. It might make sense for you as a tenant to give some of that stuff up in return for relief on rent. On the flip side, if you're a landlord and you're willing to give some rent reduction, you can get some of those things in return. But you can also offer tenants the ability to reduce their space if that's what they're seeking. It's not great, but at least you retain occupancy in a portion of the space. In terms of giving rent reduction, you can gain some of those other options, relocation option, those kind of things. So there's a lot of areas where, whether it's a monetary issue or a non-monetary issue, there are things to trade here, hopefully in the goal of mutual benefit between tenant and landlord. So far, these types of negotiations, some of which we've been involved in, some of which we've been observing, they've really just been handled by the business people, which is a good thing. It hasn't gotten into real legal battles yet, but there certainly will be some of that. But so far, back to the theme of good collaboration in the marketplace right now, everybody's sort of good cutting business deals and not depending on legal language or lawyers to sort of make these things happen. So we hope that holds out, but we do see some litigation down the road. A concerning trend that's becoming more apparent lately is what is happening on the political front as a result of this. It seems to me that many politicians are usually more tenant friendly. So we're seeing a lot of talk about, and legislation actually in the works about rent forgiveness, holidays, whatever you may want to call it, eviction moratoriums. There's actually a really, beautiful example of this. The state of California is currently reviewing a state bill that's before the representatives tomorrow. It's State Bill 939 that's being debated. And this is really not a good step from the politicians in regards to the real estate matters. But basically, the impact there is a state law that can be put into place on an emergency basis that will basically give tenants the right for 12 months of free rent, all kinds of stuff that's very bad landlords. So, and will have unintended consequences. So we're hoping the politicians keep a level head. Don't know if that's going to happen, but we are seeing some concerning things on the political front that are not landlord friendly. And then the last thing that as it relates to COVID-19 is we do see pretty significant changes operationally in the real estate world. Some of these I've mentioned earlier, whether it be increased burden on hotel owners, office building owners, there's just going to be a different system that needs to be put into place. And many things, whether it's increased janitorial services, will result in increased operating costs, which will ultimately lead to some value impact. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out on the operational front. So with that, I think that's it for my part. Bill or Cynthia, I think we have some more part of the program, and then maybe we get to questions later.
So actually, we do have several questions, so maybe we'll get to that first, and then I think Matt has a few words. A lot of questions on valuation. So I have, you mentioned there's opportunities for buyers now because of the lower valuations. How would you advise sellers? A similar question was if somebody was planning on putting their properties on the market prior to COVID-19, should that person consider putting them back on the market sooner rather than later? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I would recommend that if you're a seller, I would wait it out a little while. There is a mentality right now with buyers that, hey, they're going to take advantage of the situation and get a steal. So you want to avoid that mentality. And we do think that things are going to settle out here and people are going to be a little bit more rational, but I would not want to be selling into that environment. And then the second thing that makes me say you should wait a little while is just the debt markets. As I mentioned, debt is less available, and when it's available, it's more expensive and harder to get, which will, make it more difficult for buyers to make a deal work and be able to pay more for the property. So for those two reasons, I would probably wait it out a little bit if you're a seller. And so
another question was, you had talked about the lag time for evaluation not showing up until second quarter 2021. The question was sort of like, does this mean the market's not going to bottom out till then, or we just won't see it on paper?
Yeah. It's going to be, so as I mentioned earlier, it's interesting to look at what's happened in the public real estate market. And given that, these things are traded every day and the stock market is always forward looking, on average, the public real estate companies the pricing has been reduced by 15 to 20. Initially, it was down to they were off 40% from where they were pre-COVID. That's settled back to sort of 15 to 20% down. So that's the public market. But yes, the private market takes time for that to ripple through the system, if you will. And so we expect not to see the full impact of value reductions sort of apparent in transaction activity until, later this year, early next year. So hopefully that answers the question.
So we had some questions on cap rates. I have a couple questions. What's the formula to calculate the cap rates? Is it similar to a P/E ratio on common stocks? And then the follow-up question, are there regional differences do you see with respect to cap rates and valuations specifically for commercial multifamily properties?
Sure. So the first question, yes, it's a similar concept to a price to earnings multiple, although it's sort of the inverse. So a PE multiple, clear by definition, price is the numerator, earnings is the denominator. Cap rate is just the reverse. So the cap rate is the income or the earnings is the numerator, and the price or the value is the denominator. So it's a percentage basically. And so same concept. In a PE multiple, if the price goes up and the earnings go down, that expands. So it's quote more expensive. And in a cap rate, if the income goes down and the value goes up, it's the same concept. So it's a widely used metric of valuation in the real estate market versus a multiple concept. And then the second part of the question being, differences. Yes, very much so. There's difference in cap rates between the different property types. So for instance, a hotel is viewed more risky, and so people want a higher cap rate on a hotel versus a apartment building. And then in addition, there's differences in location. So a property in Beverly Hills will have a very low cap rate relative to a property in Timbuktu, small town, whatever. So it's a function of risk reward, and people are willing to pay a lower cap rate in a much more economically vibrant area versus a less vibrant area.
So we have a bunch of questions on landlord-tenant issues. The first being, have you seen any successful evictions, or do you know of any what's happening with the eviction process? For instance, if people were not paying in January and February and now they're claiming COVID-19, what would you recommend in that instance?
So generally, we're not seeing evictions. And I think a couple of reasons. One is back to my point earlier about, being collaborative and empathetic. Most landlords are taking that approach, understanding that this is a very difficult time and it's not necessarily their tenant's fault that they lost their job and can't pay the rent. Plus, they figure, having a tenant that may pay the rent is better than an empty apartment unit or whatever the case may be. And then there's the political implications. Given they don't want, landlords don't want to be viewed as the mean landlord that kicked everybody out when things were down. And they are also, to my point about the politicians getting involved here primarily on a misguided basis. They don't want to be the target of bad press or a political situation. So generally, we're seeing landlords take a pretty passive approach in allowing people to stay in place and working it out.
So we have a couple of legislation questions, and then we'll probably wrap it up. Do you see any legislation coming out for landlord protection?
We haven't seen anything that's landlord specific. Clearly, there's a lot of talk generally about business liability going forward, whether your business is owning real estate or your business is, having your employees in an office building or whatever, and the implications of people getting sick so I think, it's been pretty widely reported that there's some folks at the federal level that are looking at limitations of liability for businesses, but we haven't seen anything yet specifically regarding landlords. My guess is there will be legislation that comes out on that will prescribe certain minimum standards that landlords have to adhere to, maybe similar to a ADA requirement or something that if they maintain those standards, they'll be somewhat shielded from liability, but to be determined. We haven't seen anything specifically relative to limitation of liability on landlords yet.
So there's one question, I don't know what I'm just not familiar with SB 939 for residential, commercial, or both.
It's very, at this point, we believe the intent is for both. It's very poorly, in my opinion, very poorly drafted. I think the whole concept is misguided, and then the drafting of it is very unclear. So the definition of tenant or impacted party that can claim, these relief methods is fairly wide ranging, the way it's drafted currently. So at this point, I would assume that it applies to both kind of residential tenants as well as commercial tenants.
Okay. I think we're pretty much done. I do want to say that Chris mentioned that we are able to share his slides. So we're going to be sending out a thank you, and I also will send out the slides after the presentation today. And then I think I have one more question. Do you see any hope for Newsom or LA Mayor reducing some of the burdensome regulations in building single or multiple properties?
Very good question. Seems like we're talking about this a lot. Honestly, being a California resident for most of my life, and I'm not confident in current political leadership's understanding of how this real estate ecosystem works. If they make it more tenant friendly, make it more difficult on landlords, developers, they're going to continue to have the affordable housing issue. Obviously rent control has become a big topic. Clearly, implementation of rent control is not supportive of what they say their goal is, which is affordable housing, because they're just providing disincentives to developers to build housing. I am not hopeful that Newsom nor Garcetti are ultimately going to do the right thing. So, personal opinion.
Got it. Well, Chris, thank you so much for all of this. We have so many questions, and I'm not sure we have the time to get to them all. I know Matt has some comments to make to wrap it up, but we really appreciate your time and all of your information. Matt, do you want to pick up from here?
Yeah, Bill, can you put the slides up? Bill?
Bill?
There he goes. Okay. So, Chris, that was extraordinarily informative, up to date, and actionable. And on behalf of the Jewish National Fund and our donors, thank you. It was, I think, if you don't mind, we'd like to call on you again. So,
please do. Thank you.
So, Bill, go to the next slide. So, people always ask, so why is the Jewish National Fund, we just concluded our fourth program on a bunch of financial topics. So why do we do this? Because and what my job is as a Chief Plan Giving Officer, along with Cynthia and Robin and Bill, is to show people how we can make gifts, help themselves, help their families, take advantage of the best the tax laws have to give us, so that you can make charitable gifts, help your heirs, and maybe come out a little better on the other end financially. And the reason why we had Chris and we talk about real estate is over the years I've been with the Jewish National Fund, we have done a lot of real estate transactions. Oddly enough, most of them from California, in all in many big sizes. And what we talk about with our donors is that many times, I know we have donors that own buildings, they've been owned them for years, they've been depreciated down to zero, and now they look, so how do I get out of this thing and maybe make my life easier without having to pay the taxes associated with this disposing highly appreciated real estate. And we have been showing people how to use one idea, but it's very creative. It can be very flexible. We can do a lot of things with it. Is the area of donating the building to a charitable remainder trust. The charitable remainder trust will pay you income, and what you do when the building is sold by the trust, there's no capital gains taxes. You get a tax deduction for the full fair market, well, for the appraised value of the building, and then you get a portion of that based upon the present interest. In the end, what you are getting is practically, in most cases, we're able to do this, the same cash flow, but what you've done is you saved yourself a bunch of taxes, and if you're in that estate bracket where it needs to be done, you've also saved yourself some estate taxes as well. In some cases, we've been able to show people that they could donate the building or property, take the deductions, get the income, and if we can be creative, we don't do this, we recommend this out, if you could use life insurance creatively, when you pass on, the asset that you gave away goes to your heirs tax-free, I might add. So what we look to is we look to show donors and our supporters who might have some real estate that we can be really creative and show you some interesting things. Bill, next slide. All right, so this just describes what I just described. You gift to the trust, income goes back to the donor plus tax benefits. When the donor passes, whatever remains of that trust, that's the name remainder, goes to the Jewish National Fund in this case for the work that we do on behalf of the land and people of Israel. So it is it's a really creative tool and can work really well when the numbers work out and we can structure it for the benefit of the donor, their heirs, and of course the Jewish National Fund. Next slide. The other thing that we've been dealing with recently is this notion where we create a charitable lead trust. These discussions have popped up a lot in the last 3 or 4 months. And what a lead trust is you take your property, you donate it to a lead trust. The lead trust pays the income to the charity for a number of years. When the trust terminates, the property itself is given back to heirs or the donor themselves. You can go 2 ways with it. And the reason why we are talking about it now, and the reason why this is so effective now, is that interest rates are so low, discount rate being 0.8%, that we can structure charitable lead trusts where the value of the property and the deduction are equal, which means it's 100 cents on the dollar. So if you're in an estate problem where you might have estate taxes, we can show you how you could give away a significant amount of your assets to your children with an interim income to Jewish National Fund, and maybe there's a good chance we could do it at a 0 cost basis to the kids and to yourself, and maybe show you how to take a tax deduction at the same time. So what we're asking is simply, next slide. We own I'm not going to get into the donor advised fund because I'm running out of time. We'll save that for another day. Next slide. So what we're saying is this: we are blessed at the Jewish National Fund. I lead an extraordinary, passionate, and very well-versed team of professionals. Ask any of us, and we'll be able to show you some creative ideas. If you're in the real estate business and you have clients that you think could be helped, give us a call. We're a great resource. We're a great place to start. We work really well with the legal and the accounting communities, and we have shown a lot of donors over the years how to not only save taxes, help their heirs, but do good work with the money when it's all over. And those are my remarks. If there are any questions, I could take a couple.
I think Mark Whitcoff does have a question, and I'm trying to unmute him.
He's unmuted.
Is
Go
he
ahead,
on?
Mark.
No? Daniel, can you? Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to interrupt. Chris, I'm a JNF volunteer and donor in real estate, and I want to thank you for giving your time and doing the work to make this presentation, and everybody for joining us. My understanding is that it's really important to us as owners of properties and investors in properties to come together with the plan, giving people at JNF, and see how we can all support JNF. And part of what engages us is that when we engage with each other about real estate and what we're all going through right now, where we can give helpful tools to each other. But I just want to remind everybody that JNF for 109 years is not political, and that we don't take sides on any political issues. We also don't give each other legal or tax advice. So I appreciate your opinions, Chris. If we were to have a discussion with each other, I might end up disagreeing with a lot of the things that you presented, and we can disagree. But I would like to say that those of us who are helping advise the governor's office right now on AB 939 in California, I personally would differ with you that this particular law helps landlords more than it helps tenants, because where you're going to get forbearance and where you're going to be able to get relief from lenders has to do with how this law is structured, so that legally tenants not paying will help the landlords as well. We're all going to get through this together, but I just want to remind people that we can all have different opinions, but the important thing is that we all support JNF and come together. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, it's yours.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us on this call. Chris, thank you so much. We really appreciate all of your time and your information. We had so many questions we didn't get to. I know that people might be emailing me afterwards, so I'm going to email out a thank you, and if you have something or comment, just let me know. But we really appreciate you being part of the JNF family and taking the time to join us today. I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you all.
Thank you.